Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être venus très très nombreux à cette table ronde. Il est 16h30 précise. Donc...
Good afternoon to you all. Welcome to this roundtable. It's 4:30 sharp, so we can start our debate, our discussion, and we'll try to imagine the future, which is always a bit dangerous, but very stimulating. So we'll be thinking about the world after the American elections. We know that in 2024, about a quarter, 25% of humankind has gone to the polls, but the results are not the same everywhere. When you see a country where there's very little voting, and when you have a very high score for the winner, you can say that it's a poll that maybe did not correspond to the criteria that one could expect from your election. But a lot of polls, a lot of elections, and one upcoming election on November 5th is certainly attracting our attention, because American voters will say who will be in the White House for 4 years, but they will also elect the Chamber of Representatives, 1/3 of the Senate, and a lot of governors in North Carolina, for instance, and in many other states. So an important election. Why? Because the United States, for the past 80 years, are always the master builders of the international architecture that we've seen emerge after the end of World War II. And for the past 80 years, the Americans have had difficulties, failures, and we can see that they are certainly faced with a surprising number of crises, traditional, conventional wars, one state against another, as in Ukraine, non-conventional wars, one state against the militia in Gaza, or we can see it also with what's happening on the northern border of Israel with Hezbollah, civil wars, phenomena that ignore borders, be it climate change, pandemics, or phenomena like terrorism, so that all these crises put the United States in less a good position as in the past, because they're being contested, because from revisionist powers, if you like, because they consider the world order dictated by Washington doesn't suit them, Russia, China, or powers, opportunistic powers that are playing upon American difficulties, thinking of their own specific interests to try to benefit from geopolitical games that escape the United States. So the world after the 5th of November will try to think about that with Isabelle Lebon. Isabelle is an economist, she's an academic, and she published a book called The United States in the 21st Century. So do get it. Martin Cancé, who's head of the German Marshall Fund office in Paris. The German Marshall Fund is a think tank that is focusing mostly on the transatlantic relationship. And to my left, Xavier Chemisseur, who's the editor-in-chief of France 24, and who's also has a chronicle on France Info talking about international topics. Before we start, I'd like to go back to one interesting element, which is the Normandy Index. And the Normandy Index is it's a ranking, and the aim of the ranking is to rank countries on a scale from 1 to 10, let's say, in terms of conflictuality. And before we talk about the United States, what the Normandy Index is of the United States, you should see it on the screens.
Il ne s'affiche pas.
Yes.
Si. Bon, peut-être que l'indice Normandie va nous rejoindre.
Maybe the Normandy Index will join us.
Ah, ça bouge. Voilà, nous y sommes. Donc on voit.
So the Normandy Index is 5.52.
conflit.
And in the ranking in terms of the countries most at risk of conflict, 90 out of 138, 90th out of 138. So two reasons maybe. First is the fact that the atheists are committed around the world, and part of alliances that expose the country to various conflicts, but also the fact that the domestic situation in America, that very strong divide between two sides, the Republicans on the one hand and Democrats on the other. You know what happened on the 6th of January 2021 when the disputed results of the presidential election resulted into an assault against Congress, when Congress was stormed by protesters. So that could explain why that normally index for the United States is only 5.52. So there'll be two candidates on the 5th, facing each other on the 5th of November, with the surprise of July, with the appearance of an expected candidate, Kamala Harris, who took over from Joe Biden after a disastrous debate against Trump. Kamala Harris, as a vice president, traveled the world to carry the word of her country, but the international policy was decided by Joe Biden. So we'll go back to that international policy bequeathed by Joe Biden. Do you think that Kamala Harris would continue that policy, would break away from that policy? And it's up to me to answer to that. I think there's a form of continuity, because if you heard Joe Biden at the National General Assembly of the UN, in his last speech in front of the UN, part of the speech was echoed what Kamala Harris said in the past few weeks. The situation in Gaza, yes to the right of Israel to live in peace, but yes also to the possibility of Palestinians to live in their own state and in dignity. So we can see that there are nuances that have emerged in the Democrat discourse and that were put forward. Firstly, Kamala Harris, for instance, said we need to fight anti-Semitism, it's true, but we also need to fight against Islamism. And Joe Biden had not necessarily linked the two aspects, but when he talked about Gaza and Israel, he said, or he took a clear stance, or he used the stance that had been put forward by Kamala Harris, which wasn't necessarily his, saying that the only way out was a ceasefire, but the idea to resuscitate the two-state solution, two-state being the creation of a Palestinian state next to Israel, is something that we considered a change, a real change. I was talking to an American diplomat who was supposed to join us today, and he said that it's quite amazing because for a long time the two-state solution was never mentioned by American diplomacy. There were a number of analyses that were possible. He was saying that Kamala Harris came in with Joe Biden had been placed in jeopardy by this conflict, because young people in American universities had certainly using the question or what made it their own, and were challenging Biden on this in the Democrat camp, but there will be. What is for certain is that if Kamala Harris gets into power, she won't act in a violent or rough way. There's a lineage which is that of Barack Obama's, of Joe Biden's, and we know that she has ideas in a number of domains. She's trying to move forward by in a soft way, because she can't shock an electorate that's been told something and that would be told the opposite a few weeks later. But but she is making that role her own, and she's certainly percolating ideas that existed in the Democrat side, but that were maybe not at the forefront. Martin, we're talking about continuity as a specialist to the French-American relationship. What vision do you? How do you see the vision of Democrats on the international level? I agree that there's a continuity between Obama, Biden, Harris, and the continuity of these three presidents, if Harris gets elected, is that Democrats consider that the international order, the current international order, should be preserved. And the aim of the party is to keep the order in place which benefits the United States and their allies. And it's a party that sees international relationships as, or that sees itself as sees its role as that of the stabilizer on the international level. But the problem is that stance is that if your program is to get back to the status quo, it's not very exciting. And that's the limitation to me of Joe Biden's policy for the past 4 years on the Ukraine, while supporting Ukraine, enabling Ukraine to defend and survive the Russian assault. But the Democrat administration cannot envisage the fact that Ukraine would win the war. Their aim is only to help Ukraine survive. Same, supporting Israel after the 7th of October attack is that. But there's no long-term vision to try to solve the deeply rooted cause of the conflict and move on towards a more stable order. Regarding China, which is the great point of discussion in America, there's a Republican position with Trump saying we're in a competition with China. I want to win it. The Democrat position is we have a competition with China. We're going to manage it. And so there's a difference between a project that wants to win against Iran, win against China, and a project that wants to contain and preserve what is the international order today. So that difference defines the Republican and Democratic perspectives on the international level. For Europeans, there's a reassurance that comes from Biden and Harris, because they say we're there to keep NATO in place, to make sure that the European security that you've known since 1991 and the end of the Cold War can last. But a number of Europeans are also critical, saying you're not enabling us to solve problems. You're not enabling the Ukraine to win, because victory against Russia is not the ambition of the Biden administration, and you're only there to manage the present. Thank you, Martin. So managing the relationship with China. So there's two words that come up very often: decoupling and de-risking. When Europeans and Americans are thinking about the relationship to China. Isabelle, can you? When Biden came into power, he said that things would change compared to what Trump had done before him. Did you see a lot of changes on China? Can you go back maybe to these two terms, and what do they mean?
Pardon, excusez-moi avec le vent. Donc,
sorry, it's a bit windy.
On va se poser la question par rapport à la Chine, et donc je vais revenir un tout petit peu.
So going back to or maybe going back in time a little bit, Republicans and Democrats are not real. There's not a real opposition between them, because they both agree that China is their main competitor, and that risk needs to be managed. So would there be a victory, as Republicans say, or as Trump says, it's another problem? But managing that risk is mostly making sure there's not too much interdependency between the two economies, and have that decoupling of both economies, which means not being dependent on China in a certain number of
Administration Biden.
areas, and we can see that Democrats with the Biden administration have launched things that are not very visible, but are research programs, for instance, on semiconductors, on electronic chips. It doesn't sound like much, but it's part of the major issues of tomorrow to know whether the United States will be completely independent from Chinese technology,
Si on parle de l'administration démocrate, redevenir leader sur ces
or maybe become leaders in the world in these areas again,
les besoins qu'ils ont d'intervenir.
and move away from the needs of independence they have from China. I'm not talking about debt, which is another issue in terms of its interdependency, but Donald Trump positions himself as saying either we win or they win, so we need to make sure that we do win. And how can we win? The only solution is not interdependency between economies, but to just win. And to win means to weaken China.
Question de la dette.
There again, there's also the question of the debt, because the second holder of the external American debt is China, behind Japan.
Côté, un non
So we've got an ally on the one hand and a non-ally on the other.
Par contre, effectivement,
So that stance is a lot more aggressive and in Trump's economic program. So how does he want to win over China? To defeat China he's saying
de la balance commerciale
we'll reduce the issue of the
de la Chine est un problème
of the commercial deficit of the United States. But it's 400 billion in deficit a year with the exchanges between China and the United States. So it's huge.
Pour y arriver, eh bien, on va leur imposer des droits de douane.
And so the idea is to impose tariffs that would be massive. So in his program, Trump is considering having tariffs, against everyone, including their allies. Of course, there will be a reaction from these allies, but
Qui est une
so he really is putting himself in a situation, or he's having a very aggressive stance regarding his allies, saying that it will fund our program, that is to say, tax deductions.
les droits de douane, on les paye dans son propre pays et que c'est une autre manière de taxer ses citoyens. Mais évidemment, 10% pour les autres,
But of course, 10% for any country, 60% for China, and of course, China will be on their knees if I can manage to do that. But it's forgetting the fact that
à être en paix et à avoir une diplomatie apaisée avec ses voisins.
we need.
Si c'est
But if you're at peace with your neighbors, it's because it's profitable. And if it's profitable to have a more conflictual relationship, then there will be a conflictual relationship.
C'est un peu rapide de
Isn't it a quick reaction to say that Europe and the United States, to say that between Europe and the United States it was better under Biden? If we have a look at the Inflation Reduction Act,
levier
or
formidable
that lever
renouvelable.
for renewable energy, wasn't that seen as a form of aggressiveness against Europeans? Isabelle? It's less aggressive because it's less direct. But yes, it was something that was it was considered by Emmanuel Macron as unfair competition between the United States and Europe, and that Inflation Reduction Act was, while promoting renewable energies in the United States, there was also the
Alors, on va pas dire une mesure
obligation to produce within the United States. So it was not a protectionist measure like tariffs, but it was certainly a national preference measure. It was also a way to try to strong arm international competition. But the discourse was less aggressive, so in terms of diplomacy, it didn't have the same impact, even though it's only redirected a number of industries towards the United States.
Que cette mesure
Martin, hasn't this measure
déception. Les Européens qui attendaient peut-être.
Wasn't this measure part of a disappointment from the Europeans that expected a lot more from Biden? And so yes, there was support to Ukraine, but beyond Ukraine, what can we say about Biden? If in 2050, what will historians write about the Biden administration? Maybe Ukraine will just make us forget everything else, just like Iraq and the invasion of Iraq certainly erased everything else that Bush had done. Biden is the opposite, but with Ukraine. But I do feel that there's a French specificity on the question on the question you just asked. The French people or the government, the French diplomats, tend to be quite critical in terms of what Biden has done. Because so there was a lot of disagreements, economic measures taken by Biden, and were bad for French economy, for European economy. There's also a number of geopolitical issues. We're not aligned on the China question, on the Chinese question. There's a number of European issues where Joe Biden sent signals that we wanted to hear. The United States are here, NATO's here, don't worry, your safety is guaranteed. But it's going to put Europeans to sleep, and the French tend to be a bit annoyed when positive messages from Washington are seen by our European partners saying, we don't need to build the Europe of defense. We don't need to work between us because the United States are saying that they are still here and they'll defend us. So it's a message that's very difficult to hear from Paris. If you're in Tallinn, in Berlin, or in Warsaw, it's very different. What's important is to hear that from Joe Biden to say that we'll respect the North Atlantic Treaty. The United States will continue to guarantee the safety of NATO allies. If the Russians are at your door, we'll be there, and we'll make sure that Russia don't invade you. So that's a priority for them. But for the French, because of our geographical specificity, because we have the nuclear bomb, maybe we're less threatened by other European countries. It's not the only message we want from the United States. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Martin. Xavier, I would like to have a few words with you about the perspective of the election of Donald Trump. Can we talk about a big fear for Europe, despite the critics we mentioned concerning Biden? Are we afraid of his coming back? Of course, there is fear. And I think that in the choice of some European characters, like the European Commission, some profiles, there is a reflection that we have to be compatible with the United States in many fields. So if Donald Trump is elected for the second time, the first election makes it possible to reveal, to be a revealer, because among the decision makers there is some angelism towards the United States and China. For many years we have accepted Chinese technology at the limit of the embassies with the Huawei aerial. And where we were saying it's a danger for national security, and we were accused of being anti-Chinese. So when Donald Trump came to Paris, started to be against his allies, and this was badly considered in Paris. So it was a surprise for some countries who are particularly aligned with the United States, like Germany, European countries like Central Europe or Eastern Europe countries. So then the questioning of NATO, again, revealed Donald Trump's policy. So it was revived, and the question of NATO was revived. Again, as Martin was saying, we had a Biden saying, don't worry, we will be there. But opposite, the United States still came with planes, aircraft, tanks, and they benefited from the situation to offer American weapons. So against protection, you have to buy the latest tanks and so on, F-16. So this is why Central and Eastern European countries accepted to give their weapons to Ukraine in buying or exchanging with American weapons. So this was implemented by the Americans. And for many people, including in Paris, we think that the war in Ukraine, you had a sort of a showcase or shop window, but on the other side of the medal, they became a real competitor of a European defense, a European army, a European issue that is always questioned with Germany, who have not been in favor of this for a long time. They changed their mind recently. They are in favor of it as long as their armament industry is a beneficiary. But because within the European Commission, we always have to accept and pledges for Germany. Donald Trump, is he back? Everybody is afraid, but still we have the impression that the idea of reorganizing in case of the removal of this protection shield, American protection shield. So all the countries have to think about it, but they say, no, America will never do this. But on the other hand, you have some European countries who are not at all afraid about a victory of Donald Trump, like Viktor Orban in Hungary. The Prime Minister is not at all afraid of the victory of Trump. He's met him several times. He's very much aligned with a lot of questions with Donald Trump, as he's aligned with Vladimir Putin on some issues. So the question in the end is, behind the power of the United States and the power entrusted to this man, how is Europe going to react? As a powerful Europe? During the war in Ukraine, the European Union were able, at least with a facade, a united Europe. And Viktor Orban had to leave the room so that we can validate the support for Ukraine. Can it still be the case if Trump is elected? With the increase in power of the nations revisionistic Europe's BRICS, Russia, Iran, and other countries who want to join the BRICS, like Algeria, and we're having more and more candidates. So Europe, who is protecting European countries, could find themselves divided with only a facade unity, because the question is, based on principle statements, Europe has always united, more or less united, principle statement, but then when they have to take actions, it's more difficult. This is what Jacques Borrell was saying in the conversation. If Europe were aware of the risk run because of Putin, would they be able to react as they did facing the COVID? Facing the COVID, the risk is there in front of you. You know that you're going to be sick and some people will die. Facing geopolitical risks, it's not so clear. But still, the Russian risk is existing at the borders of Europe. But Trump is completely Vladimir Putin compatible. All the decisions taken by Trump at that time, when he was president, he succeeded in what he wanted to do, like getting away from the nuclear agreement with Iran, and we have many, many examples. these decisions did not reinforce the United States in the short term. They reinforced these revisionist countries and countries questioning the American and European leadership.
Face à un
Yes, so we could expect a quite aggressive Donald Trump with Europeans. It was already the case when he wanted during his first mandate that Europeans spend more money for their weapons. But Martin, you're defending another. See this? Can you explain? Well, there is this hope that the fear of Donald Trump, we can be more united as Europeans. I think that the reverse could and will be true. Donald Trump will probably say, I have to have bilateral deals. I don't want to talk to the European Union. I want to have a deal with France, a deal with Germany, and everything. He wants to divide to be more powerful. But as Europeans, we don't have the same interests and feelings, perceptions of the threat. It will be very difficult for us to agree instead of going to Washington and sign the deal. Based on my experience, when I talk to the American administration, the American diplomats say it's always very funny. Every time we have a new administration, we want to talk to the French, to the Germans, and to the Europeans, and everybody agrees. But at some point, the French come up and say, but could you help us again, the Germans? And then the Germans come, we have a problem with the French, and could you help us? And then the Polish people will say, we have to complain about Germany. So this division, European division, of course, it's for the benefit of the United States, and they will benefit from it. And Trump is very good at this. He could say, let's take a scenario that is really fearful for Europe. Let's say he comes to power and he wants to sign a deal with Putin that would, for instance, recognize the Russian sovereignty on the territories that have been conquered. And this deal would be unacceptable. But Ukraine, most of the European countries are against this Russian sovereignty. But then if Trump come and say to the Europeans, if you do not sign, I will not come to the next NATO summit, and then I don't think the American soldiers have to die to save Denmark or Sweden. So very quickly, the Europeans will understand how to choose between the survival of Ukraine and the defense, American defense. So even though the countries the most threatened by Russia will have to sign the deal and support his policy and in a way abandon the hope that Ukraine could survive after the war, after the invasion. Something else. Trump administration number one, I'm not sure it was in favor of Putin. I think we can reverse this. Because, first of all, Donald Trump has a very interesting argument. That is the energy politics under Trump that was using a maximum of the resources, oil resources in the States, and shale gas and all this, so that we can reduce the prices of oil. This is the treasury of Putin that you are targeting. And the Republicans always say our energy policy cost more to Russia than all of the sanctions implemented by the European Union after the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, the cost of this politics, all these people don't give a damn about the environment policy and environment crisis. So they have pipelines, and we destroy the environment. But that's the best way to fight against Putin. We have had a long discussion about environment before he joined the administration, and they reached their highest figure of production of oil. If Trump, I always have the same question, if Trump is elected.
Grover Cleveland à la fin du 19e siècle, parce que d'habitude, un président américain battu
Since Grover Cleveland, this never happened. Usually, when a president of the United States loses his election, he goes home and makes some conferences and gradually disappears. But Trump maybe will be successful. If he comes back, he will set custom fees everywhere that will be paid by the American consumers. How can it work? It cannot work. It cannot work. That's a quick answer. But we have to be more relative concerning the states because it's a country big enough, the market is big enough to create a disruption in the prices. In other words, okay, can you explain if a country of the size of France imposes custom fees, saying we will impose custom fees on cars, for instance, this will have no impact at all on the prices of the worldwide market. All the other competitors will just add the French custom fees. Technically, they will pay for them, but indeed, the consumer, the French consumers, will have paid them beforehand, and the importer will give back the custom fees for any types of economy smaller than the United States or China. Custom fees have no impact at all on the importers, and everything depends on the consumers. When you are a big country and a large economy like the United States and China, massive economy, they have the capacity to create a disruption in the prices when they impose custom fees. The majority will be paid by the American consumers, so necessarily it will create a problem when we talk about the purchase power, which was the main issue during the American campaign. But anyhow, they can disrupt more or less the prices so that the importers can still import and pay some of them. But this will reduce the size of the American market, and China, which is on the borderline of overproduction, will have stocks to sell. So they will look at the other markets, such as Europe first. And in Europe, if we have too many goods, we will have to protect ourselves. And again, the question is, 30 years or 40 years after GATT and OMC, the Worldwide Trade Organization, and for the worldwide trade, this will be a big impact. So it's like going back to the jungle, commercial jungle. Yes, if everybody imposes custom fees, there you always have retaliation measures. So it's not necessarily custom fees or sanitary standards or standards that are no longer compatible with your production, but again, there will be retaliation all the time. And I'm only mentioning custom fees without thinking about the retaliation measures. And again, to give you a concrete example, custom fees imposed during the previous Trump administration against China cost a lot of money to the soya producers, American soya producers, because China decided to buy from Brazil. And they overtaxed the American soya and bought it from another country. So it cost a lot of money to the American agriculture. So, okay, so let's go back to both candidates and their differences. On the one side, we have the Democrat candidate who will not insult the United Nations or the NATO or bilateral organizations. And on the other side, who do we have? Could you, the three of you, answer this question? Is Trump isolationistic? What does it mean? What would be the isolationism of Trump? Who wants to start? Xavier. Well, the question is always the same with Trump. What can we do with the power of the United States? It's a powerful country, but in suffering from a crisis 9/11, subprimes, financial crisis, the COVID was something very significant for the Americans because we were talking about we had COVID also, but in the United States, dead people, dying people in all the cities, and a big difference between the ones who could afford seeing a doctor and the other ones dying at home. Then the Iraq war, the war in Afghanistan, and so on. But it's a question of power. And Donald Trump says to be powerful, you have to be better than the other one. You have to win. To win, like in a catch struggle, I'll be the winner and I'll be more powerful. So what can we do with this economical power, military power? What can we do with this power with Donald Trump? Donald Trump again, question again, asked again the questions. Okay, shale gas, where the difficulty was Russia, but by putting multilateralism in difficulties, he opened new questions. By questioning, by refusing to be the gendarme of the world, to be the cowboy or the sheriff of the world, well, in the end, he was opening doors to other possibilities, the possibilities to attack a neighboring country. And we could not expect much, because if the United States don't do anything, the United Nations won't do anything because they are paralyzed. So we can continue. And the signal was sent for Syria, for instance, halfway between two administrations. The same signal for Ukraine, and the signal we can see it in other wars or conflicts taking place right now with the historical ally, who is no longer an ally because they want to stay in power. It's the Prime Minister in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. The war, I am cynical, but the war is serving the project to remain in power as long as possible. So an ally is no longer an ally, and Joe Biden became aware of this. I think it was in May or June. He had a ceasefire idea. He thought it was acceptable by all the parties, because all the parties answered the key questions and red lines. But then he found himself with the ally saying, I want a total victory. This idea of total victory is not at all in line with multilateralism, which is that in the end we no longer discuss. We win or we lose. Can we call it isolationism? Well, his idea, and what I am interested in is the people surrounding him. It was written and said, America first. Okay, I can be interested in the rest of the world as long as the rest of the world will bring me something. So this is isolationism, but it's a threat. And then you have to give me something back. This is like business, in the business world, you know. This is what the United States do, even allies, like the submarine. The submarines, we were mentioned, the submarines between the United States, Australia, UK, and France. France had an agreement with Australia concerning nuclear submarines, and then Joe Biden decided, and the American administration managed to get a change from the Australians, who in the end decided to buy the American submarines, and who will not be delivered before 20 or 30 years in time. So the way of treating the ally is like opening a door under Donald Trump, and it is a risk that is really present
relations qui ne sont plus
on all types of relationships which are no longer multilateral, they are bilateral. And the Europeans are not good at this, you see, because each country wants to keep their own policies. An example, for instance, Iranian nuclear. We have a discussion between the States, Russia, and the British, still member of EU, and then the German, the French, and a European representative. And the Iranian were delighted because, in fact, everybody wanted to play their own role. When we can talk about economical nationalism when we talk about the States or China. Who is the European who will defend European economics or nationalism? They will always choose the Chinese bicycle, which is cheaper.
ou la Chine.
So the States and China understand that they are really powerful with the economy and the diplomacy and military power. And we are in a new era, and this power, they have to show it to benefit from it. It's useless to have a power that is sleeping, and this is what Trump was reproaching to NATO. It was a sleeping power, depending on the United States, and in the end, under Joe Biden, the Europeans started to realize, to think about the question of defense, like Polish people, and in fact, he may be isolationist, but as long as there is an interest for him.
C'est une fausse question.
So, Martin, is it
C'est pas une fausse question.
Martin, isolationist or not, is that a real question? I think a lot of people ask themselves the question. Trump doesn't have the consistency to be defined by one type of ideology or one vision of the world. You can put him in a book on international relationships as isolationist. That's not the way he works. There again, Trump uses arguments that many other American presidents have used before him. And his pitch is to say, "I've done it," when all other presidents just promised it. All the American presidents during their campaign say, "We'll stop policing the world. We'll stop being the sheriff of the world." Bush campaigned in 2000 saying, "Let's stop being concerned with the world. What's those stories in Rwanda, Yugoslavia." I just focused on the Americans. But a few months in 2001 was September 11, and he went to Afghanistan and to Iraq. Obama said the same thing, said, stop all these wars. But a few years later, there was an operation in Libya. He had to support new operations in Iraq against Daesh. Joe Biden arrived at the White House saying, "I really will stop these endless wars. I'll be brave enough to stop the operation in Afghanistan after 20 years." And a year later, he has to support a war in Ukraine. And Trump says, "When I was the president, there was no wars." And it's a very simplistic argument, but it works because the Americans, since the end of the Cold War, want their president to stop policing the world. It shouldn't be the president's ambition, and the American policy is not how can I protect Americans, how can I make sure that there's peace in Taiwan. It's not their focus. But that doesn't mean that Trump is a nationalist. When he had to strike Soleimani, the Iranian general, he did it. He went against Bashar al-Assad. Obama had refused to give weapons to Ukraine. Trump did it. So Trump's not detached from the world, but he has a stricter vision of what American interests are. Isabel, isolationist, nationalist. I'd like to go back a little bit, saying that the nationalism of American presidents for the past, you talked about Bush, and you also talked about Obama. There's also the fact that the Americans have really refocused on the Indo-Pacific, which they're their territory in a way, and we feel abandoned as Atlantic partners when the Americans turn to the Indo-Pacific, but look at a map, and you realize that the Americans are a Pacific power more than an Atlantic power, and they have interests and territorial interests that are very far into the Pacific, very deep into the Pacific, with military bases, and that's why the fleet is in the Pacific mostly. So that vision of isolationism is also our vision of successive presidents, saying they're looking at the Pacific and they're abandoning us, which is not quite true, because as you said, when
vers la zone atlantique, eh bien
when there was a need to go back to the Atlantic zone, they all did.
vers les guerres du XXe siècle.
But they have the feeling that they're being taken back to the wars of the 20th century, when their vision of wars of the 21st century is the Pacific. But even in the Pacific, we saw that the various choices of American presidents, and Trump is maybe there's more discontinuity there when we look at things. But Barack Obama had launched a Trans-Pacific Partnership on trade, which was supposed to be a very large trade alliance, excluding China, because for human rights reasons. When he got to the White House, Trump immediately moved away from that and said that Trans-Pacific Partnership will be without us. Biden came into power, and Biden went to a more multilateral vision within the Pacific, but through information or intelligence agreements, AUKUS, Quad with India, Japan, and Australia, the Five Eyes. So a multilateralism that escapes us because it's not focused on us. And in that respect, regarding the Pacific, that's where we saw very clearly the break between the Trump administration and the ones before him, where there was a rupture, there was a surprise, where there was an attempt to have alliances beforehand, and then these alliances were broken. So in that respect, I do feel there's an isolationism in terms of these partnerships from Trump, who considered these alliances, these multilateral alliances, weren't favorable to America. And that's more visible than in his behavior in the Atlantic.
On a d'un côté une administration.
So if I summarize, we have a democratic administration where we can see,
On le voit aussi
where with weaknesses that are visible. We can see that in Israel, or in Israel and Palestine, or in the Ukraine, where they can convince the Congress. And we have a Trump administration more than a Republican administration, because Trump has certainly colonized the Republican Party, working on his priorities, with a gut feeling and with very strong nationalistic dimension. What world would that produce?
D'un monde plus ou moins
Are we moving away from a world
mondial
that was under the new world order that came from the Second World War, with tools that enabled us to avoid the worst, and through the UN and its agencies? Or are we moving towards zones of influence where it's very much the law of the jungle? How could it emerge, Martin?
Logiquement, il y a toujours une période.
Logically, there's always a moment of disorder before we get to a new order. And I agree. An era is ending. The idea that the United States have enough power to force various players to do things they don't want to do, to guarantee the stability of the world order, that idea has ended.
En partie sur les cendres de l'Irak,
It ended after Iraq,
avec des gens
but also with people like Trump who said it's not our ambition.
tout à fait imaginer que cette
And
période
we
de
could
transition
imagine that transition period that might be very fragile,
va
maybe
prendre de nombreuses années. Et
with
nous,
chaos that could last a number of years. And us, Europeans, will have to undergo the consequences of that new order.
il y a plusieurs théories. Une
It could be a new order with two powers, just like we had in the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the United
les
States
États-Unis et la Chine.
with China and the United States this time.
Ces puissances, il y a un,
And around each of these powers, there might be a number of countries, of partners, of allies that are spaces of influence. One possibility. Another possibility is that there's no power hubs, if you like, but there are a number of countries that try to play their card.
plus émergents, ils sont
And we've got countries that are emerging countries that have emerged, like India, like Brazil, Indonesia
qui
soon,
auront eux-mêmes leur capacité
that will have a capacity to define the world order. When India doesn't want to do something, neither China nor the US can force New Delhi to do something they don't want to do.
Une question pour les Européens.
There again, that's another question for the Europeans. What is our part in this new order?
Deux puissances
If it's an order with two powers, should we align on one of the
capables
two,
de créer une sorte de
the
troisième
US or China, or can we create a third way? Or if there are several powers, are we able to
le meilleur
emerge and choose the best power every time?
sans être particulièrement cynique. Tout
I don't want to be cynical. Every country in the world wants to have their cake and eat it. There's not one country that doesn't want to maximize their interest while paying the least as possible. It's the aim of every country.
qui peuvent voir cette
And there are countries that can see that chaos and transformation as a great opportunity to find a way.
Chine.
When
Quand on fera
if you have to have a deal with China, we'll do it. And if we want to have security guarantees with the US, then we'll do that. A pays like Saudi Arabia, a country like Saudi Arabia, like Brazil, they've shown that they could play on several levels, and they could be real winners of that transition.
Du XXe siècle.
Isabelle, at the end of the 20th century, when successive American administration fought for China to join WTO with the idea of Montesquieu that commerce could enable China to become softer or gentler. And maybe we could convert China to what we see as democracy.
On a vu que ce calcul
We saw that calculation wasn't right, didn't succeed, but what's left of that leverage of commerce, of trade, to try to put order in that world?
siècle où finalement
Yes, at the end of the 20th century, the American model seemed to have won. Soviet Union had fallen with the Berlin Wall.
que c'est la fin de l'histoire.
Some thought that it was the end of history, as you know, the famous phrase, and that a new world order would be based on democracy. And there was a belief
Si je ne fais pas d'erreur par l'administration
by the Clinton administration that pushed for China to join
de la Chine dans l'OMC,
WTO,
l'Organisation mondiale du commerce,
so the World Trade Organization.
eh bien, intégrer la Chine au nouvel ordre mondial.
And so that means that China would be part of that new world order, and it's the end.
C'est aussi dans le calcul même d'avance
And the idea also was that one would oppose Russia to China, or China to the Soviet Union that still existed at the very beginning of that calculation, so that would enable
relation
the US to benefit from that.
tout en lui donnant effectivement
Diplomatic relations, then trade relations,
de l'OMC
by giving,
qui sont extrêmement importants.
and also China had rights in terms of within WTO as an emerging country, and so very favorable rights in
Extrêmement
terms of
préférés
patents, in terms of
existent encore pour le moment. Et donc effectivement, il y a eu
technical
cette
transfers and so
illusion
forth. So
que
there was that illusion that it would normalize
enfin,
But it was
finalement,
nearly believable for one stage
que ça allait
that it
normaliser
would normalize things, that
cet immense pays, cette immense puissance,
huge country, that huge power would become a democracy
imposer,
and hence impose
sachant qu'effectivement, l'un des
impose that democratic model
et que ça allait
to the
pouvoir,
world. India is also a democracy,
qui n'a pas du tout fonctionné.
but it
Et
didn't work.
c'est même pire que ça, à mon
And
sens.
it's even worse, in my opinion, because
L'idée même
it also questioned the idea that democracies were the dominant model in the world, and
en Chine,
instead of establishing democracy in China,
démocratie
it meant that a number of people in our countries questioned the fact that the democracy was the dominant, the winning model, or the best model economically, the most efficient model economically. And what you see in these polls
de démocratie
on the world
avec
scale, there was
des pays qui se sont
certainly
extrêmement
a
bien
fall back from democracy with countries that have developed very well,
Xavier,
while being very far from democracy.
dépeint
Xavier Martin
le monde du chacun pour soi en quelque sorte.
was talked about a world with each for their own, but when there's a pandemic, when there's a transnational crisis,
Imaginez,
should we
espérer
not hope that there might be
du multilatéralisme.
the tools from multilateralism might remain? Yes, there are a few. I mean, the UN. Let's talk about the UN. We talk about the
également,
the United States are weaker on the international stage. It's the same for the UN.
le constat que ce
When Biden made his speeches from the UN, he said that didn't work anymore.
alors c'est dur à
The
entendre pour les
Security
Français.
Council, it's hard to. He's saying that we're going to lose our seat to the Security Council, and it's something that the French have fought against, with Europeans saying that the seat to France, the seat of France should be given to European Union, with the possibility to broaden the number of countries
Dans ce
that are present or that are members of that Security Council,
compte, les puissances,
taking into account, of course,
mais en ouvrant la
powers that have emerged, but opening the door
justement à des pays de
to
l'Indo-Pacifique.
countries from the Indo-Pacific.
Que les Européens et que les
So
Français
Europeans and the French will need to have a group therapy, because it means that we need to
également.
be aware of that lost power, or that power that is to be lost,
européenne,
and a challenge.
mais finalement,
People
regarde,
always say that the European Union is always very strong when there's a crisis, but look at the war in Ukraine and COVID. It was the only moments when Europeans could agree was when of the crisis. Think of the subprime crisis in 2008. The finance became regulated very, very quickly.
l'Union européenne, c'est le domaine réservé des États.
COVID, health was something that was depending on states and not on the European Union. In a few weeks,
Puisse
the
avoir
European Union
une
was able to have a response to COVID. The war in Ukraine, there was a question to have a reflection on European defense, or having
Pendant les crises économiques,
group purchases.
comme beaucoup d'Allemands, à chaque fois disaient que c'était pas possible d'emprunter, c'était pas possible de faire une
And
dette
every
commune.
time there was an economic crisis, and Angela Merkel always said that no, we can borrow so much and so forth, and we did. So we need to.
Changement. Peut-être que là, il va falloir, et ça sera en.
So I think that
Là, en plus, on peut y réfléchir.
the EU will have to think about that change, and we've got a few weeks, a few months before
De l'élection
the
américaine.
results of the result of the American
Ça
election and its consequences. But I think it opens possibilities.
il faut réfléchir collectif.
But there again, we need to think collectively on the European level, and it's difficult to think collectively when there's 27 of you. So to keep existing, we need to
Réfléchir.
reflect as a community. How can we make sure? How can we be stronger? Some try to play it solo, leave the European Union. We've seen that it doesn't really work. So I think to be stronger,
On est
and
sans
it's
doute
proven by figures, you
présent au sein de l'Union européenne, mais ça veut dire quand même qu'il va falloir se réinventer.
that yes, you're stronger when you're within the European Union, but we need to reinvent ourselves, because we talk of the power that are the European, that are the US, but the EU has refused to be a commercial power or regulatory power. We need to accept the fact that we need to be a political power, a military power, and build things together. So we go back to ideas that were developed by Jacques Delors many years ago, so back in the 90s.
Ces idées qui ont été abandonnées,
Or ideas that were abandoned,
mais qui nous reviennent un peu en boomerang parce que
but that come back to us
on n'a pas voulu s'y confronter pour
because we
rester dans le
didn't want to
confort.
confront those ideas because it was
Que, bah,
easier.
Ce monde, on ne va pas l'empêcher d'évoluer.
But the world will keep evolving, and what
Dans les années 60, 70, 80, 90, c'est en train de se réaliser et qu'il faut se
was
réveiller.
predicted in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is happening now. So we need to wake up.
Il faut se lever pour aller au boulot. Bah là,
So
peut-être qu'il faut se lever, se
the
regarder.
alarm clock is ringing. We need to get up and go to work, and we need to discuss and try to find
Les évoquer à Bruxelles pour finalement
a compromise, to
Dire,
accept that we grow and evolve. But it's like a therapy. It
Merci,
takes time.
merci Xavier pour ce.
Thank you, Xavier, for that
On va
moderate optimism.
séance de questions.
So we can have a Q&R. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Mics will be circulating.
Et-
Raise your hand.
Prenez la parole. Il est entendu qu'une question est une question.
And a question is a question and not a comment or a point of view or a speech. Thank you.
La première qui se lance aura la considération de la salle. C'est
So
le
the first to ask a question will certainly be esteemed by the whole room. Who wants to start?
Une courageuse sur ma droite.
Bonjour. Pour en
Good
revenir
afternoon.
à la guerre en Ukraine,
You're talking about the war in the Ukraine.
c'est pour savoir est-ce qu'il faut mettre du coup nos valeurs
Do you think we should
écologistes de côté
put our ecological values aside
des États-Unis
and follow the behavior of the United States that are a lot more polluting when in Europe we wanted to have that neutral goal in 2050. So should we do that to counter Russia and save a country that is Ukraine? Great dilemma, priorities.
Le sort d'une nation l'emporte
So
sur
the fate of a nation, should it trump, so to speak,
et l'urgence climatique.
the climate debt or the climate
Ça sera peut-être abandonné.
progress. Decarbonation is part of the Biden plan, might be abandoned by Donald Trump, but it's a decarbonation through the economy.
Revenir dessus.
So you could say more about this, but it's part of the
Joe Biden
it's
avec
part of the democratic imagination and that of Joe Biden to create powerful companies
la croissance économique via le verdissement
and have growth through a greening of the economy.
Du gaz de schiste.
But
Et
there's still shale, gas, and
précédente élection, et que ça soit Joe Biden ou Kamala Harris,
Biden or Kamala Harris.
pour dire que ça alimente aussi la puissance
Kamala Harris and Biden agree that it fuels the American power.
de choix et de valeurs. Cette question se posera au sein même de l'Union.
So I think that question will have to be asked within the European Union
Les élections qui ont été
because
européennes
the European elections
de juin dernier ont quand même
last June showed that a number of blocs have emerged. The ecologists have lost a lot of seats. The Green Deal had been negotiated by Ursula von der Leyen. Ursula von der Leyen had been negotiated with the Greens, but also with the PPE,
dans beaucoup de pays et très
or the European Popular Party, so the right-wing party in the European Parliament, that is not very favourable to ecological measures. But there are three nationalistic or extreme forces that are not in favour of ecology.
un tableau assez
So
alors qu'on y
the
réfléchisse
picture
tous
seems
ensemble.
quite dark, but that's also something we need to reflect
Ce Green Deal qui était
upon together, because that Green Deal, there was a compromise, there was disappointing for a lot of people,
pour les Verts pas assez fort,
not strong enough for the Greens,
trop
for the right to binding. That will be a question from the outside, but also from the inside.
et Et ce, dès que la Commission
as soon as the European Commission
va commencer ses travaux,
starts working,
en train d'être présentée. Et
it's
donc, en
being,
gros,
it's being
à partir
presented, and from January,
ce sera un défi en
it
interne.
will be an internal challenge within the EU.
Cette contestation même des valeurs écologiques, elle est vraiment
Ecological values are very much disputed and contested, and it's latent within the EU and in other countries.
Parce que
I don't know. Martin, do you want to respond?
C'est
It's a great question, and it's the kind of question that, and it's a question that makes me happy not to be a politician, not to have to take decisions.
on discute. C'est le problème, c'est qu'on a
The problem is that we've got limited resources,
environnementaux, des enjeux
and there are environmental issues, security issues, technical issues that mean that we need huge funding to be
différents de celles des États-Unis, parce qu'on n'a pas
to
forcément
be solved. And
cette
in the case of Ukraine, we're not in the American position. We don't have shale gas or shale oil,
géopolitiquement, d'abord
and we don't have hydrocarbons to produce to
la guerre
to-
la guerre en Ukraine.
give us a more favorable position on the
Intéressant.
geographical and geopolitical level. But there are issues there's the issue of security and ecological
Les pays qui sont
aspects to defend the countries that are to the east of the EU, like the Baltic countries. We don't have the infrastructure to send our tanks in these territories. There was a scenario that was done a few years ago
invasion de
of an invasion of Estonia by Russia.
72 heures.
It took between 48 to 72 hours to get tanks there. Or it would take 48 hours or 72 hours for Estonia to be invaded by Russia. How long would it take us to regain that territory?
En Lituanie,
The rail tracks, when you get to Lithuania, were done in the Soviet Union. So not tracks that can accommodate trains directly from Europe for ammunition, for instance, and military equipment. Same for roads or bridges that are strong enough for a Leclerc tank. And it requires money. And economically, it doesn't make any sense.
il y a d'autres enjeux infrastructures.
And there are other infrastructure issues in Europe. Austria wants to have green trains to cross the Alps. What should we choose? Should we fund
Transport le plus écologique possible
ecological transport in an area that's very important economically for Europe, crossing the Alps, or should we make sure that we can defend a country? We have an alliance, we have a treaty with these countries, so we have to defend them if they invade it, but we don't have the infrastructure capacity to do that. It would cost billions of euros, and we need to make that choice, and I'm happy that I don't have to make it.
Je vais pas rajouter grand.
Isabelle, I will not add too much because the answer was already a long answer. In my opinion, the question can be rephrased in the long run. What about ecology? Will it be better if we forget about our values and we accept the defeat of Ukraine? And this is the question. So in the end, will it be better? And what about the risks for the rest of Europe, for countries which are members of the NATO, and then based on the agreements, it's required for us to defend them. So each one has his own opinion, and I'm very happy not to have to take a decision, political decision. 2 + 1 more questions over there.
Comment interprétez-vous
Sir, how do you interpret the support statement from Putin in favor of Kamala Harris? And what about the consequences in case of the victory of the Republicans between Putin and the United States? Let's listen to the 2 other questions.
Pardon. Je voulais savoir.
I would like to know As Kamala Harris is succeeding to Joe Biden, and Joe Biden left, or the way he left the campaign, it was not well done because he's losing his memory. Is it going to have a negative impact on his image, on her image? And she could become the first women president of the United States. And during the debates, we can see her, she smiles. She's less aggressive than Donald Trump. Could this have a negative impact on her image in the long run? And she had to defend values for the first worldwide powerful country. Well, thank you for your discussions. It was very enriching, very interesting. Don't you have you mentioned the imperialism of America and China. Do you think it is possible, and if yes, how? Is it possible to imagine a future when the relationships between the countries would be more equal, so we could have a more lasting peace and a more stable peace? Yes, very interesting question, huge question. A last question over there.
Speak English.
Please do.
The non-belligerence can be a strategy used from the whole European Union to promote peace. The non-belligerence, like sending diplomatic croix rouge and blah blah blah, can be a strategy used from the European Union to promote peace.
Merci. Alors, qui se lance?
Thank you. Who wants to start explaining to which question you're answering? I will take a few questions and then I will give you the mic. Putin and Harris, I think this is a troll from Putin. It's easy to say I am in favor of Kamala Harris. He knows it will be a bad news for her. I don't think it's very significant, and I see that the Republicans are using this message because it's no good. Harris after Biden. Well, Joe Biden is changing the rhetorics. He's saying, have been a such big leader that I made an effort, and I accepted to stop the campaign for the American democracy, a sort of sacrifice, like a Christic sacrifice by leaving the seat to Kamala Harris. This is the rhetoric, the rationale of the Democrats after the debate you mentioned, which was a very difficult debate. As far as Kamala Harris, if she's obliged to take some position because she would be the first woman president in the history, we have several examples of leaders, she leaders in different countries, like Margaret Thatcher, who was not that soft, Giorgia Meloni, Golda Meir. I think that nevertheless, in the American situation and for the Democrats, there is a trauma from 2016 with the defeat of Hillary Clinton. So we have to break the glass ceiling. Donald Trump has lost all his election except against Kamala Harris. He lost in 2018, 2020, 2022, and so on. The only one who lost against Trump is Hillary Clinton, and this is the anxiety of the Democrats about this glass ceiling. Concerning strength relationship, I would like to say, if you have some equal strength relationships, you will have more conflicts, because very often when you have a form of hegemonic or hegemony strengths. You have peace. You had peace during the Roman Empire around the Mediterranean Sea. It's when countries consider that they are equal and they can attack the other because they can win, there will be more conflicts. When you do consider that it is impossible to fight against such and such powerful country, there is more stability and more peace. I don't know if my answer will help you, but this is my what I think. Isabelle? Well, I would like to add a few words. I will not go back to Putin supporting Kamala Harris because hoping that this would be negative to her. But this doesn't mean a lot. But he's afraid of seeing her coming into power. And I would like to add that concerning Joe Biden and his removal, he did not really removed, well, he removed from the campaign, but the way you said is as if Kamala Harris is already the president of the United States. Okay, he removed himself from the campaign, but he's completing his mandate. So he will have done a complete mandate. He announced that he would only do one mandate. So we are going back to the original idea of his own presidency mandate. Next, concerning the campaign and the defeat of Hillary Clinton facing Trump, was a defeat with a difference of 3 million votes. You know, between the popular vote at national level and the vote by the Electoral College. But she won the popular vote. But the difference between the two candidates is that Kamala Harris is not presenting herself as a woman, not at all like Hillary Clinton. Maybe you're too young to remember, but Hillary Clinton was saying the first woman president in the States. Kamala Harris is not saying this. She was a prosecutor in California, and she was really a very strong hand iron woman, and she's presented like this, and she will present herself like this, and she will be like this if she becomes the president of the United States. So the approach is completely different. I'm afraid I have the same opinion concerning, I will give you one figure, the fear of seeing Trump coming back to the White House. We mentioned the NATO. I know the NATO countries today, what did they do? Well, they increased their military expenses to reach the 2% expected by Trump, but not only by Trump, but by all the successive American administrations. So it's true, we bought a lot of military weapons, military equipment, American military equipment, so all these average powerful countries bought the right to be protected by the United States. So this explains a lot about a balanced peace. And presently, they are buying the right to be defended by increasing their expenses above 2% of the gross national product. I'm sorry, I'm quite negative about your question. And then the question about the system that could make it possible for Europe to promote peace. I'm afraid it's by preparing war. And again, Europe should accept to have a European defense to be independent. Because honestly, nowadays, these expenses, you know, for the increase of these expenses for military equipment, and we buy American equipment, show that Europe is not at all ready to settle or to set up a European defense. Okay. I remember Kamala Harris during the election of Donald Trump, and I think it was Kamala Harris. She was quite natural. She was angry and her speech was very tough. And she used to say, as long as we have a Donald Trump, we have to commit into politics and we have to fight against this type of character. And I'm sure she will do the same. She's in a period of supporting Biden towards the exit. It's a transition period, and that's difficult. And besides, I think that the debate with Donald Trump, when Trump worked for 2 hours and she worked for many days in a closed room in a hotel, and she succeeded in being between quiet and offensive. And this is, I guess, what we expect from someone who is supposed to preside a country like the United States. But at the end, it will be up to the electors, the citizens, to choose to vote. So as I said before, I think on the Democrat side, I think they are one candidate late. When Hillary Clinton presented herself, I think that Joe Biden was in a better position to win the election. Okay, Hillary Clinton got more votes, but she lost at the other level. The great electors, Kamala Harris always remained in the shade of Biden because this is the role of a vice president, but clearly the idea was to put her forward so that she could take the power. She could come into power. She learned a lot, and I'm sure that if she can be elected, she's a great character. As far as peace is concerned, peace is like democracy. It's something that seems very natural and acquired forever, but we can see that it can be questioned very quickly. For instance, Ukraine. So this war makes it possible for us to open our eyes, but the job is not over, the work is not over. We are still late. I mean, we had the Society of Nations, we have the United Nations. We've seen their weaknesses, their incapacity, so we have to reinvent them. And we have to support those who support the peace when we vote. It's not what some social media say, nor other countries like Russia or China, because the advantage is to have a weak Europe. Europe is weak, the voice of Europe is weak. Why Europe is not showing the way, the path of peace, but it's too weak because its diplomacy is very often in the shade of bigger European states. They say they want to play a diplomatic role. Now a new commissioner, Karia Kallas, she comes from Estonia. Yes, she will be in charge of the European foreign European policy. She's a character. I've met her. She's a tough woman. She will not accept easily to leave her room, to leave her seat easily. Her culture, because she's lived with the Russian threat and with Russian-speaking parties which attacked her a lot. She's a strong character. Sometimes it is thanks to the personality of someone when it is possible to put forward to defend values. So we could believe in her, but we could believe also in Joseph Borrell. Her statements were very little read since, but it's very interesting what they say, their political positions, and unfortunately the echo was not sufficient in the media because pleading peace is less glamour than plead war. We are in a world where disruption is more interesting for electoral reasons. So as long as we let ourselves be attacked by the others, and I do not miss the conference we will have tomorrow about democracy and populism, I think all this will be a challenge we have to face. But Europe could have this role, but they need to want it, and there are 27 countries which have to agree, so some of them have to renounce. So who is going to give up? So it's 6 o'clock now. It's the end of the conference. Thank you for your attention.
Merci pour vos applaudissements. Nos intervenants les méritaient. Bonne continuation et bonne fin de journée.